Thanks for listening to this episode of History's Greatest Battles. If you enjoy this episode or others, please subscribe and share this podcast with a friend. I recently just finished 2 books, one about the history of the Crusades, a scholarly work, and another about the origins of Islam, and especially in those first few early centuries. Both books reminded me of a quote that I was told by my best buddy in high school. And he was told this quote by his grandfather, who was a POW in World War II, drafted into the ranks of the German military and sent to Canada. He said, "Gods don't kill people. People with gods kill people." Let's now experience that phenomenon at the Battle of Jerusalem.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 1, Episode 40, The Battle of Jerusalem, from the 9th of June to the 18th of July, 1099. Muslim forces, roughly 20,000 soldiers. Crusader forces, 1,250 knights and 10,000 infantry. The Crusaders' triumph signaled the apex of Europe's bid to impose its dominion over the Holy Land. Yet, beyond the battlefield, the Crusades set in motion the resurgence of papal power, as the Church reasserted its iron grip over the political affairs of Europe, reshaping kingdoms and crowns under the weight of divine authority.
In the closing years of the 11th century, 2 titanic struggles erupted, reshaping the fate of Christendom. One thundered through the heart of Europe, where the Pope stood firm, locked in a bitter contest with the Holy Roman Emperor, both clawing for dominance over the intertwined thrones of religion and politics. While crowned as the Church's protector, the Holy Roman Emperor often seized control with an iron grip, dictating not just the selection of popes, but daring to shape the very ranks of the Church's hierarchy. The Pope, enraged by this encroachment, sought a way to bolster his authority and command the respect of Europe's nobility. In the east, the Byzantine Empire trembled as the Seljuk Turks, emboldened by their relentless rise in the Middle East, delivered a crushing blow at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. With that victory, Asia Minor all but fell to Turkish control, and Constantinople itself loomed dangerously close to the enemy's gaze. These twin crises converged, offering both the Pope in the west and the Emperor in the east an opportunity to exploit their mutual need for survival. Emperor Alexius Comnenus, a man as cunning as he was determined, deftly maneuvered between rivals while refilling his depleted treasury. Ready for action, he called upon Pope Urban II, invoking the plight of Christian pilgrims allegedly barred from sacred sites in Palestine by Muslim forces. The routes had indeed become impassable, though more from the disarray among Muslim factions than by deliberate malice. Nevertheless, it provided Urban with the perfect rallying cry, a cause that could unite Europe's warring lords under the banner of faith. With this crusade, Urban could elevate his own standing, spread the reach of Christianity, tighten Rome's grip on the Eastern Orthodox Church, and, perhaps more importantly, direct Europe's war-hungry nobles toward a new enemy, the infidel, rather than each other. Previous popes had already blessed wars against Muslims in Spain, making the notion of a holy war against non-believers familiar, if not expected, across the Western world. The response was overwhelming, far surpassing the wildest hopes of both Urban and Alexius. Across Europe, thousands surged forward, answering the call for reasons as varied as their number, some driven by faith's fire, others chasing the promise of absolution, while many sought simply the thrill of conquest, of wealth, and of new lands. For the younger sons of noble families, disinherited and forgotten by birthright, the crusade presented a rare path to glory, a chance to carve their own legacy in blood and in steel. Yet none among them could fathom the true horror that awaited, the brutal reality that would test their mettle beyond any dream of glory. Tens of thousands of peasants, inspired by the fanaticism of Peter the Hermit, marched blindly into the maw of death. They scraped their way through Eastern Europe and into Asia Minor, but lacking arms, training, and any sense of strategy, they were butchered mercilessly by the Turks. The German Crusade met an even darker fate. After rampaging through their homeland, slaughtering Jews with reckless abandon, they set off for Constantinople, only to be torn apart by Hungarian forces before they could cross the frontier. These pitiful endeavors did little to bolster Byzantine confidence. Yet their true fears were realized when the real warriors, the armored knights of Europe, finally organized and set their sights on the east. Alexius knew the danger posed by the Crusaders' insatiable hunger for wealth. Fearing they might turn on Constantinople itself, he compelled each passing army to swear loyalty to him in exchange for safe passage across the Bosporus and vital supplies. After tense skirmishes and hard negotiations, Alexius secured the safety of his city from the rowdier Crusaders, ushering them onward to Asia Minor where the true battle awaited. The Crusaders, before setting their sights on the Holy Land, first had to tear through the Turk bastions of Nicaea and Antioch. Nicaea crumbled on June 19, 1097, after a brutal month-long siege. Fierce battles followed at Dorylaeum, Iconium, and Heraclea, propelling the Crusaders ever closer to their goal until they stood before the towering walls of Antioch by October, a fortress that would soon test the very core of their resolve. Antioch did not yield until June of 1098, after two relief armies were shattered beneath the relentless advance of the Crusaders. Yet victory brought little rest. Almost immediately, the besiegers became the besieged. Surrounded by a new Muslim force, they fought desperately until, in late June, a daring counterattack erupted from the city gates, scattering the enemy in a wave of blood. The taste of triumph quickly soured as the victors, consumed by greed and ambition, quarreled bitterly for 6 months over the spoils of war. The opportunist Duke of Taranto seized Antioch for himself, declaring it his own principality. Meanwhile, the remaining Crusaders, restless for glory, set out once more, marching toward Jerusalem in the dead of January 1099. With the Pisan fleet shadowing their march and laden with vital supplies, the Crusaders advanced steadily along the coastline until they reached Arsuf. There they pivoted inland, setting their gaze upon the prize they had long yearned for, the city of Jerusalem itself. Of the vast host that had set out, only 12,000 battle-hardened Crusaders remained, led by Duke Godfrey de Bouillon of Lorraine, flanked by the seasoned Count Raymond of Toulouse and the fierce King Tancred of Sicily. Inside the city, a force of 20,000 Muslim defenders commanded by the Emir Iftikhar braced for the coming storm. Jerusalem lay beyond the grasp of the Seljuk Turks, nestled instead in the lands controlled by the Caliph of Cairo. Its defenders were Fatimids, followers of the Prophet's daughter, heirs to a lineage they believed divine. Yet to the Crusaders, distinctions among their enemies held no weight. Whether Turk or Arab, it made no difference. All were infidels, and all would face the sword. The siege of Jerusalem commenced on June 9, 1099. Too few in number to surround the city entirely, the Crusaders knew they could only seize it by brute force, not by waiting out a siege. Yet it was they, not the defenders, who suffered most. Muslim forces had poisoned the wells and cisterns beyond the city walls, and the scorching June sun battered the Crusaders without mercy, as thirst gnawed at their strength. The first assault, launched on June 12th, was a disaster. The Crusaders were thrown back, their efforts dashed against Jerusalem's seemingly impregnable defenses. The Crusaders needed siege engines to break those towering walls, but the barren land around offered little wood to build them. On June 17th, fortune shifted. 6 ships docked at the deserted port of Jaffa, bearing the timber and the tools they so desperately needed. With the aid of Genoese engineers, the Crusaders set to work constructing fearsome mangonels, their arms primed to hurl destruction, as well as towering siege engines and ladders. They intended to bring the very walls of Jerusalem crashing down or scale them to bring death from above. In the dead of night between July 13th and 14th, a second assault surged forward. Once again, it faltered. But on July 15th, the siege tower finally breached the defenses. The gangplank dropped, forging a bridge into the heart of the city. The Muslim defense collapsed in an instant. Many fled to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but the relentless Tancred of Sicily gave chase. Though he offered mercy, the bloodlust of the Crusaders was beyond control, and mercy proved scarce in the aftermath of their victory. Tancred's attempts to safeguard those within the mosque were futile. The fury of the Crusaders had grown insatiable. the streets of Jerusalem ran red as nearly the entire population was butchered where they stood. According to one chronicle, within Al-Aqsa, the blood rose to the knees, a grotesque testament to the carnage unleashed. As Raymond of Agiles wrote, quote, "Wonderful things were to be seen. Numbers of the Saracens were beheaded. Others were shot with arrows or forced to jump from the towers. Others were tortured for several days and then burned in flames. In the streets were seen piles of heads and hands and feet. One rode about everywhere amid the corpses of men and horses." End quote. The Jewish citizens suffered the same fate. Blamed for centuries by Christians for the death of Christ, they were offered no quarter. Many were herded into the city's main synagogue, where they were burned alive. After the slaughter, the victorious Crusaders made their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the sacred site they believed had once cradled the body of the crucified Christ. There, amid tears of joy and cries of deliverance, they embraced one another and thanked the God of mercies for their triumph. When the slaughter finally subsided and bloodlust gave way to purpose, Godfrey de Bouillon was hailed as the guardian of Jerusalem and defender of the Holy Sepulchre, yet he refused the title of king, unwilling to wear a crown in the city where Christ had worn thorns. The Crusaders' hard-won victory was short-lived. On the horizon, a storm gathered. 50,000 men of Egypt's armies marched northward, ready to reclaim the city. Godfrey, with barely 10,000 knights and foot soldiers, braced for the Egyptian onslaught. But at Ascalon, on August the 12th, 1099, the Crusaders met their foe head-on and delivered a crushing defeat, their swords carving a swift end to Egypt's ambitions. The Egyptians fought differently from the Turks. Where the Turks started like shadows on horseback harassing with arrows, the Egyptians relied on the raw force of a frontal assault, determined to smash their foes in a single frenzied rush. With blind faith and desperate speed, the Egyptians charged, hoping to overwhelm the Crusaders in a torrent of bodies and blades. But against the iron discipline of European infantry and the thunderous charge of the knights, they broke apart. The Crusaders stormed the enemy camp, driving the survivors into the sea, leaving Egypt's force shattered beyond repair. With the victory at Ascalon, the blood-soaked chapter of the First Crusade came to a close. The bulk of the Crusaders returned to Europe, their holy mission fulfilled. But some, hungry for power and land, remained. New Crusader states rose from the ashes of their conquests. Bohemond ruled Antioch. Baldwin took Edessa to the northeast, and Raymond of Toulouse claimed Tripoli, all nominally bound to the authority of Jerusalem. Godfrey's reign was brief. When he died just a year after Jerusalem's fall, his brother Baldwin took his place, and unlike his predecessor, accepted the title of king. Yet Baldwin's rule was far from absolute. His vassals, ruling their own lands like independent warlords, wielded power in their own right, answerable only truly to their ambitions. To secure vital supplies from Europe, Baldwin handed over control of most coastal ports to the Genoese and the Pisans, trading land for the lifeblood of his fragile kingdom. A rigid European feudal order descended upon the region, grinding the local population beneath its weight. Even Christians, crushed under the yoke of new lords, soon began to yearn for the days of Muslim rule. These scattered Crusader states, fragile and isolated, managed to endure for nearly half a century, not through strength, but because the Muslim world remained fractured, too divided to launch a coordinated counterattack. Yet when the Muslims did manage to rally, they found the Europeans to be tenacious foes, battle-hardened and unyielding. By the early 12th century, new military orders emerged. Warrior monks sworn to the church, their blades devoted to defending Christian pilgrims and Christian sacred shrines. In 1119, 8 knights led by Hugh de Payens forged a brotherhood around the ruins of Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. These men would come to be feared and revered as the Knights Templars. The very next year, the hospital staff in Jerusalem, serving since 1048, united to form the Knights of the Hospital of St. John, later known as the Knights Hospitallers, an order as ruthless in battle as they were devoted to healing. Though bitter rivals, the Templars and the Hospitallers shared a common purpose: the protection of Christian pilgrims. Eventually, they would take the fight directly to the Muslims, turning the Holy Land into their battlefield. Feudalism, with its intricate web of loyalties, bound lords to vassals and kings to nobles. Yet holding this violent system together and curbing the constant thirst for war, whether between kings, lords, or their vassals, was a near impossible task. At its core, feudalism existed for just one purpose: to maintain a standing army ready to be called to arms in times of crisis. From Durant, quote, "Every baron claimed the right of private war against any man not bound to him by feudal ties, and every king was free to embark at any time upon honorable robbery of another ruler's lands. When king or baron went to war, all his vassals and relatives to the 7th degree were pledged to follow him for 40 days, end quote. Yet in this brutal dance of war, it was not the soldiers who bore the worst. The lives of aristocrats were too precious to be wasted. Captured, they were worth a fortune in ransom. Killing them brought nothing but vengeance. Instead, it was the countryside, the peasants, and the villages that suffered the true horrors. As armies trampled through their lands, pillage was the soldiers' payment, and death the peasants' lot. Draft animals were slaughtered or stolen, forcing the peasants to toil with their bare hands. Their burdens doubled as their fields lay ravaged by war. To stem the tide of destruction and preserve its flock, the Catholic Church intervened, striving to shield the common people from war's relentless grip. From 989 to 1050, a series of decrees known as the Pax Dei, the Peace of God, were issued by popes and church councils, threatening excommunication to any who dared bring war upon the innocent. By 1027, the French churches escalated their efforts, declaring the Triuga Dei, the Truce of God, in a bid to curb the bloodshed. Under the Truce of God, warfare was strictly forbidden during the harvest season, from August 15th to November the 11th, as well as on holy days and certain weekdays. Battles were to cease from Wednesday evening until Monday morning. At its peak, the Truce of God restricted the days of war to a mere 80 per year, an attempt to tame the violence that raged across Europe. Remarkably, this divine decree had a tangible impact on the endless cycles of bloodshed. As private feuds waned, larger international conflicts surged. Knights, eager to prove their worth in combat, found fewer chances to fight at home. Hungry for glory, they flocked to the banners of the First Crusade, seeking honor on foreign soil. The Church's rules of restraint applied solely to Christians. Muslims, in the eyes of the Crusaders, were exempt from mercy, open to any brutality their swords could deliver. This unrelenting aggression, feudalism's grip, the raids, the persecutions, at last ignited a response from the Muslim world. In 1144, Zangi, the fearsome Prince of Mosul, struck back with force, reclaiming the city of Edessa from the Crusaders, a victory that sent shockwaves through Christendom. Upon Zangi's assassination, his mantle passed to the ruthless Nur ed-Din, who intensified the war against the Christian invaders, carrying the torch of Muslim resistance with renewed fury. This defiance provoked the Second Crusade, the first of many waves of blood-soaked campaigns that would sweep across the ancient battlefields of the Middle East for the next 2 centuries. Back in Europe, the establishment of Christian strongholds in the East led to more than spiritual victories. The Genoese and the Pisans, with their powerful navies, saw an opportunity and launched into a lucrative era of trade, even with their former Muslim foes. The riches of the East, the same treasures that had drawn Europe's aristocratic youth to the Crusades, were now funneled back home in the form of coveted luxury goods, commanding extravagant prices among Europe's elite. Silks from China, spices from India and Indonesia. These exotic commodities became objects of obsession among Europe's aristocracy, treasures for which they were willing to pay nearly any price. Religion faded into the background. The wealth to be gained was simply too tempting to care about the identity of a trading partner. the city-states of Italy swelled with fortune, transforming into the unrivaled hubs of commerce and power in the Mediterranean. As religious fervor cooled and trade routes opened without interruption, Italy's rise to international dominance became inevitable, driven by the riches of the East. The wealth amassed through Eastern trade, combined with the rediscovered wisdom safeguarded by Muslim scholars, ancient knowledge Europe had long forgotten, laid the bedrock for the Renaissance. In a final twist of fate, the very Renaissance, born from Crusader spoils and Eastern learning, would challenge the supremacy of the Catholic Church, launching a new era of reason that stood in stark contrast to the religious zeal that had fueled the Crusades.